The wind drifts across a battlefield that never should have existed. Shattered Mongol banners lie face down in the mud. Horses wander without riders through a silence that feels deeply wrong. Armor has been split open, not cleanly pierced by arrows, not crushed by siege engines, torn apart. And the men who once forced entire continents to bow are not pushing forward, they are pulling back. Not in any organized formation, not as a calculated retreat, but in something that looks a lot closer to disbelief. And that is the part no one can explain. For decades, this army had never truly known defeat. Entire cities across Persia were reduced to ash within a single campaign season. Empires that had stood for centuries crumbled within months. Kings who dared to resist vanished so completely that their names survived only as cautionary tales whispered by those who came after. Under Genghis Khan, defeat wasn't just unlikely. It wasn't even a concept the empire knew how to hold. And yet here, on a field far from the Mongol homeland, against an enemy that should have already been finished, something breaks. Not just a cavalry line, not just forward momentum, something far deeper, something structural. The kind of crack that doesn't kill a body in an instant, but guarantees, with quiet certainty, that it will eventually fall. But here is where the story takes a turn most people never expect. Because the battle that fractured Genghis Khan's empire may not be the one history has been pointing to. And the army standing across from the Mongols on that day may not be the force that truly broke them. If this fracture happened the way I'm about to show you, then the Mongol Empire didn't fall the way you were taught. It did, and once you see the crack, you cannot unsee it. If you're new here, consider subscribing and hitting that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love history told the way it actually happened. Now let's start where you'd expect. Who could possibly defeat Genghis Khan? On the surface, it sounds like a ridiculous question. The man had constructed the most efficient killing machine the world had ever produced, and he hadn't built it from inherited wealth or ancient bloodlines. He built it from absolutely nothing. In 1206 AD, a man named Temujin, orphaned as a boy, exiled, left to survive alone on the Mongolian steppe, united the warring Mongolian steppe, united the warring Mongol tribes under a single banner. Not through negotiation, not through diplomacy, through a calculus of violence so precise and so complete that loyalty became the only rational option available. You either followed him or you became the example he was making for everyone else. And once the tribes were unified, the machine turned outward. Mongol warfare was not simply brutal. It was innovative in ways that military historians still study today with something approaching visible discomfort. Feigned retreats that pulled enemy cavalry directly into kill zones. Psychological operations that sent floods of refugees into the next city, carrying stories so horrifying that entire garrisons surrendered before a single arrow left a bow. A speed of movement that made traditional European and Islamic armies look like they were standing perfectly still, because relative to the Mongols, they were. Between 1219 and 1221 AD, the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most dominant Islamic powers in Central Asia, was dismantled so completely that its greatest cities still carry those scars. Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, names that once meant civilization, buried under ash in a matter of months. And the myth grew faster than the army itself. By the mid-1220s, the Mongol reputation was traveling thousands of miles ahead of their horses. Kingdoms that had never seen a single Mongol rider already lived in fear of one. Rulers who had never lost a battle weren't calculating whether to fight. They were calculating whether surrender would even be accepted. That was the empire. That was the machine. Unstoppable, unquestioned, undefeated. So here is where you'd expect the story to continue. More conquests, more expansion, an unbroken line of dominance stretching from the Pacific to the edges of Europe. But that is not what happened. There was a campaign that stalled, a battlefield far from the Mongol heartland, where the usual arithmetic of terror did not produce the usual result. A decision, possibly made by Genghis Khan himself, that directly contradicts the ruthless strategic caution that had defined every engagement before it. A year that historians still argue over, not because the sources disagree on what happened, but because certain sources refuse to mention it at all. And that silence is the first fracture. When Mongol court chronicles, written by historians whose entire purpose was to glorify the Khan, suddenly go quiet about a specific engagement, that is not an oversight. That is a burial. Stay with me, because the question you should actually be asking is not whether the Mongols lost. The question is this: if they didn't lose here, why did everything change immediately afterward? The most likely candidate has several names, because history itself cannot agree on which battle matters most. And that disagreement is its own form of evidence. Consider the Battle of the Indus, 1221 AD. Genghis Khan's forces have pursued Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, the last surviving prince of the Khwarezmian dynasty, across the full breadth of what is now Afghanistan. Jalal ad-Din is no longer a king in any meaningful sense. He commands no empire. He has no supply lines, no fortified cities, no diplomatic alliances remaining. By every strategic measure, he is already finished. And yet, at the banks of the Indus River, with mountains pressing against his back and the most feared army on earth bearing down on him, Jalal ad-Din turns and fights. He should not survive this. The Mongols outnumber him. The Mongols outmaneuver everyone. The Mongols have not failed to destroy a cornered enemy in over a decade, but the engagement does not go as planned. Mongol sources, the ones that bother to mention it at all, describe a tactical withdrawal, a repositioning, a strategic decision to allow Jalal ad-Din to escape across the river rather than waste resources on a final push in difficult terrain. That is what the official record says. Now read the Persian accounts. The chroniclers of the Islamic world, writing in Arabic and Farsi, often drawing on eyewitness testimony, describe something entirely different. A shock, Mongol units breaking formation, commanders issuing contradictory orders, casualties higher than anything the campaign had produced before, and a psychological rupture that rippled backward through the ranks in a way that had no precedent in Mongol military history. Now look at the Chinese administrative records. After this period, the tone shifts, not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself clearly, but the language of Mongol governance in tax edicts, military dispatches, and the careful bureaucratic documentation changes. There is a new caution, a new emphasis on consolidation rather than expansion, as if someone, somewhere deep in the command structure, had quietly acknowledged that a limit existed. 3 sets of sources, 3 different versions of the same event, and the contradictions between them are not accidental. They are the sound of an empire beginning to lie to itself. Now add the human element. By the early 1220s, Genghis Khan's inner circle was no longer the lean, desperate coalition that had conquered the steppe. Commanders who had earned their positions through brilliance and brutality were aging. Younger generals, many of them the Khan's own sons, were maneuvering for authority with exactly the kind of rivalry that the old Temujin would have crushed without hesitation. But Temujin was aging too. Supplies stretched across a campaign theater spanning from Korea to the Caspian Sea were thinning, not collapsing, thinning. The kind of slow resource bleed that never shows up in battle reports but reveals itself in delayed reinforcements, in garrisons undermanned by 10%, in horses ridden one campaign too many. And beneath all of it, a question that no one in the Mongol court dared to speak aloud: but that every commander was already quietly calculating around. What happens when the Khan dies? Not if, when. Because the empire had no mechanism for peaceful succession. It had Genghis Khan, and Genghis Khan had sons who genuinely despised one another. So ask yourself, not as a student of history, but as a human being who understands how power actually functions. What if the empire didn't fracture from outside pressure? What if one battle, one engagement where the impossible arithmetic of Mongol dominance failed to deliver the expected result, simply revealed a crack that was already there? The danger was never the defeat itself. The danger was the illusion that the empire was still unbreakable. Here is the most accepted interpretation among modern historians, the version most textbooks offer, the one clean enough to feel comfortable. No, the Mongols didn't really lose. They recovered from every setback. After the Indus engagement, Genghis Khan consolidated his forces, reorganized his command structure, and continued campaigns that would push the empire further than it had ever reached. After his death in 1227 AD, his successors drove into Eastern Europe, into the Middle East, into Southeast Asia. The empire didn't merely survive, it grew. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. More territory than Rome, more than Alexander ever dreamed of reaching. The myth survived. The machine rolled on. The stumble at the Indus was corrected. The story continues. Take a breath. Feel how that settles. The narrative makes sense again. Now let me pull it away from you. Because here is what happened in the years immediately following that battle. The details the clean version quietly omits. Campaign tempo changed. Not everywhere, not all at once, but the relentless, almost mechanical pace of Mongol expansion, the pace that had consumed the Khwarezmian Empire in 2 years, slowed. In certain regions, it didn't just slow. It stopped. Expansion into India, the logical next target after the Indus campaign, was effectively abandoned, not formally announced as abandoned, simply never pursued. The subcontinent, which should have fallen within a decade by any reasonable military projection, remained unconquered. This cannot be explained by any military obstacle. India had no army capable of matching the Mongols. It is explained by something internal, succession tensions, intensified. Genghis Khan's sons, Jochi, Chagatai, Agede, Tolui, had always competed, but after this period, the competition became structural. Territory was divided, not as military strategy, but as political appeasement. Commands were split, loyalties were partitioned. The unified war machine began operating as several smaller machines, each one answering to a different ambition. Regional commanders gained autonomy they had never previously held. Generals who had once executed the Khan's orders without question began making independent decisions about when to advance, when to withdraw, when to negotiate. Not out of defiance, because the center was no longer strong enough to enforce obedience in real time across the full breadth of the empire. The Mongol war machine did not collapse. It decentralized, and if you understand anything at all about how empires die, you know that decentralization is not recovery. Decentralization is the first stage of fracture. It is the point where an empire begins to die while still believing it is expanding. But I won't fully explain that yet, because the question you need to sit with right now is this. If the empire kept growing, kept conquering, kept projecting the image of invincibility for decades after this battle, how could one engagement still be the thing that shattered it? Hold that contradiction. Don't resolve it. The answer has been in front of you the entire time. The battle didn't destroy the Mongol army. It didn't break their formations. It didn't sever their supply lines. It didn't kill enough soldiers to make any material difference to an empire that could conscript replacements from a dozen conquered nations. What it shattered was the myth, And you need to truly understand what that means in a way that changes how you see every empire that has ever existed. The Mongol Empire was not held together by military superiority alone. Military superiority was the mechanism, but the binding agent, the force that kept tributary states submissive, that kept conquered populations compliant, that kept rival kingdoms from testing their luck, was fear. Not fear of a specific army, fear of an idea. The idea that resistance was mathematically futile, that the Mongols could not be beaten, that any city that closed its gates would be reduced to rubble, and any city that opened them might be allowed to survive. The terror was no. In what the Mongols did. It was in what everyone believed the Mongols could do. The gap between those two things, between reality and reputation, was the empire's most powerful weapon. And at the Indus, or at whatever engagement you place at the center of this shift, that weapon cracked. Not visibly. Not immediately. Not immediately. The crack was hairline. A rumor, a story told by a survivor who shouldn't have survived. A report from a Persian merchant who passed through a garrison town and noticed something he couldn't quite name. A hesitation in the eyes of Mongol soldiers that hadn't been there before. But cracks in myths do not heal. They spread, slowly, along trade routes, through the whispered conversations of diplomats, calculating the cost of continued submission, in the private councils of kings who had surrendered without fighting and now wondered for the first time whether that had actually been necessary. The first whispers of Mongol vulnerability began moving across Eurasia like a slow infection. In the Caucasus, tributary states that had paid tribute without hesitation for a decade began delaying payments, not refusing, delaying, testing. In Persia, local administrators who had governed on behalf of the Mongols began quietly building private alliances with regional warlords. Not rebellion, insurance. In the western steppe, Kipchak and Kuman chieftains, who had fled from the Mongol advance, began drifting back toward their former territories, not attacking, watching. And within the empire itself, within the command tents and war councils and the careful hierarchy, Genghis Khan had built on the absolute understanding that his word was final. Generals began doing something they had never done before. They began calculating loyalty rather than feeling it. Which of the Khan's sons would likely inherit? Which faction would control the succession? Which alliance would be profitable? Which would be fatal? These were not the questions of men who served an invincible empire. These were the questions of men who had glimpsed an ending. Genghis Khan died in 1227 AD. The official cause varies depending on which source you trust. A fall from a horse, an illness, a wound received in battle, an assassination. The disagreement itself tells you something. An empire that cannot agree on how its founder died is an empire that has already begun the process of mythologizing its own collapse. But the timing is what matters. He died less than 6 years after the Battle of the Indus, less than 6 years after the first hairline crack appeared in the myth. And in those 6 years, he had not managed to do the one thing that might have preserved the empire. He had not solved the succession. He had named an heir, a Gadai, the compromise choice. Not the eldest, not the most capable, the one least likely to trigger immediate civil war among his brothers. A choice made not from strength, but from the mathematics of managed decline. And the moment Genghis Khan's body was carried back to Mongolia, the moment the great unifying force was removed, the crack became a canyon. Not immediately, not in a way the empire's enemies could exploit right away, but the machinery of fracture was now irreversible. Egde drank heavily and constantly. He expanded the empire into Russia, into Poland, into Hungary. But he expanded it the way a man spends an inheritance without possessing the discipline that earned it, without the strategic patience that had made each prior campaign self-sustaining. and beneath Egde, the sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan began the slow, poisonous work of turning an empire into a family dispute. Jochi's line claimed the Western territories. Chaghatay's line claimed Central Asia. Tolui's descendants, who would eventually produce both Kublai Khan and Hulagu, claimed the richest prizes of all, China and Persia. Each branch remembered being Mongol. None of them remembered being unified. The worst part, the part that should genuinely unsettle you, was not that the Mongols bled on a battlefield beside the Indus River. The worst part was that the world saw them bleed, and once the world saw it, once the idea of Mongol invincibility was punctured by even one ambiguous, arguable example of failure, the fear began to drain. Not like a dam breaking, like a slow leak in a vessel that no one can locate. Now, here is what the following century actually looked like, told without the comfort of narrative structure, because what happened doesn't deserve structure. It deserves witness. 1241 AD, Ogedai Khan dies. Drunk or ill or both, the sources can no longer agree. And by this point, they have stopped trying. His death triggers the first full succession crisis, not because there is no heir, but because every faction believes it has the rightful one. The Mongol armies in Europe, which have just devastated Poland and Hungary, which are within striking distance of Vienna and the heart of Western Christendom, receive the recall order. They turn around, not because they were defeated, not because Europe had found a way to resist, because the princes and generals commanding those armies needed to return to Mongolia to participate in the political contest that would determine the next Khan. Europe was saved not by European strength, but by Mongol dysfunction. Let that settle for a moment. The survival of Western European civilization as a coherent political entity may owe more to Mongol succession disputes than to any army, any fortress, or any act of European resistance that history has chosen to celebrate. 1251 AD. After a decade of political maneuvering, Mongol Khan, grandson of Genghis through the Tolui line, takes the throne. He is competent. He is ruthless. He genuinely attempts to restore the unified vision. It does not work because the empire is no longer one thing. It is four things pretending to be one thing. The Golden Horde in Russia and Eastern Europe, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate forming in Persia and the Middle East, the Yuan dynasty taking shape in China. They share a bloodline. They share a founding mythology. They share almost nothing else. The Golden Horde converts to Islam. The Ilkhanate converts to Islam, but a different political expression of it. The Yuan dynasty adopts Chinese bureaucratic traditions. The Chagatai Khanate fractures into sedentary and nomadic factions that develop a deep mutual contempt. Each Khanate builds its own administrative language, its own tax system, its own diplomatic relationships with outside powers, its own definition of what it actually means to be Mongol. This is not collapse. This is something worse. This is an identity dissolving while the name remains. 1260 AD, the Battle of Ain Jalut. And here is where most documentaries place the shattering. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt meets a Mongol army in the Jezreel Valley, in what is now Israel. The Mamluks win. It is the first unambiguous, undeniable, militarily decisive defeat of a Mongol army in open field battle, and it matters enormously, because Ain Jalut does something that the Battle of the Indus only hinted at. It proves the myth is not dying. It proves the myth is dead. After Ain Jalut, the Mongol advance into the Middle East stops permanently. The Ilkhanate consolidates. It does not expand. The psychological weapon that had conquered half of Eurasia, the absolute belief that resistance was futile, is gone. But here is what most histories get precisely wrong. Ain Jalut did not shatter the empire. Ain Jalut was the moment the world confirmed where, at it had already suspected for 40 years. The shattering had already happened. At the Indus, in the succession crisis, in the slow and silent decentralization that had turned one empire into 4 resentful fragments. Ain Jalut was not the cause. It was the autopsy. The decades that follow are not a story of dramatic collapse. They are a story of slow grinding dissolution, which is worse to observe and infinitely worse to live through than any single catastrophe. The Golden Horde wars with the Ilkhanate. Mongol fights Mongol. The descendants of Genghis Khan shed each other's blood over territory that their grandfather would have considered a single province. The Chagatai Khanate splits into eastern and western halves. Then the halves split again. Local warlords, many of them Turkic, many of them Muslim, few of them loyal to any Mongol identity, fill the power vacuums left behind. The Yuan dynasty in China maintains the most coherent Mongol governance, but it does so by becoming Chinese. Kublai Khan builds his capital at what is now Beijing. He adopts Chinese court rituals. He employs Chinese administrators. He funds Chinese art and Chinese infrastructure. And in doing so, he creates something magnificent and something that is Mongol in name only. By 1368 AD, the Yuan dynasty falls to the Ming rebellion. The Mongols are driven back to the steppe. In China, an empire that ruled for barely a century is remembered not as Mongol governance, but as foreign occupation. In Persia, the Ilkhanate collapses into successor states by the 1350s. In Russia, the Golden Horde fragments into the Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of Crimea, the Khanate of Astrakhan, smaller and smaller pieces of something that once stretched from Korea to Hungary. The empire didn't explode. It dissolved, the way salt dissolves in water, slowly, completely, until you cannot find the original substance. So no matter how carefully you look, and the question you should be carrying right now, the one that will not leave you comfortable, is this: who benefited? Regional elites, rival kings, local administrators who had served the Mongols faithfully, stopped being profitable. The merchants and bureaucrats and minor nobles who inherited fragments of the system and built their own small kingdoms from the rubble, they benefited. Who was forgotten? The original vision, the Mongol unity under Temujin. The idea, however brutal its execution, that the steppe peoples could build something that rivaled any civilization on earth, that was forgotten, not destroyed. Forgotten, which is worse. History remembers conquests. It rarely remembers the precise moment fear stopped working. And once fear stopped working, once the myth cracked at the Indus and shattered at Ain Jalut and dissolved into a century of fratricidal decline, cohesion died with it. Not because the Mongols were weak, because the thing that had made them strong was never entirely real. It was belief, and belief, once broken, does not return. You have been watching a story about the 13th century, but you haven't really been watching a story about the 13th century. Every empire that has ever existed, every system of power that has projected dominance across populations too large to control through force alone, has relied on precisely the same architecture the Mongols built. Reputation, myth, the psychological certainty held by the governed that resistance is not merely dangerous but pointless. It is the most efficient form of control ever devised. Cheaper than armies, more durable than walls, more persuasive than any ideology, until it fails, and it always fails the same way, not in a catastrophic battle, not in a dramatic revolution, not in the moment the history books choose to remember. It failed. In the moment someone sees the empire bleed and thinks, quietly, privately, almost invisibly, "Oh, they're mortal. That fort is the most dangerous force in human history. More dangerous than any army, because once it exists, it cannot be unthought. It spreads through populations like a contagion no quarantine can contain. It moves along trade routes and through diplomatic channels and across dinner tables where men and women who have spent their entire lives in submission suddenly look at one another and ask, what if we didn't have to? The Mongol Empire was not destroyed by the Mamluks at Ain Jalut. It was not destroyed by the Ming dynasty in China. It was not destroyed by any external force. It was destroyed by a hairline crack in a myth. A crack that appeared on a riverbank in 1221 AD, and by the 40 years of slow, invisible erosion that followed. The empire fell because it believed its own story, and when the story was disproven, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in a single battle that court chroniclers tried to bury, there was nothing underneath it, no institutional loyalty, no shared identity beyond conquest, no mechanism for survival that did not depend on the absolute, unquestioned certainty that the Mongols could not be stopped. Remove that certainty, and what remains is not an empire. It is a collection of armed men who remember being powerful, and that memory fades. If this kind of history is what you're here for, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It tells the algorithm that stories like this one are worth finding.